where I went. I went. But, yeah, we should go. So I don't know. I don't have a clue. Where am I raising? I parked. I walked in, I'm like, I started walking around, I'm like, okay, I'm going on town. And I knew this was came up. So I wanted to go see the state house. Yeah. Yeah. So I managed to walk around. And then I get
I saw this work.
Oh, no. It's going to be a so one thing right there. We are. The next time we go back, now I would know where the parking had occurred. Now she's.
Yeah. Yes. We give it 2 more minutes.
Hello, how are you?
Sorry, I missed the first. Why was it? I'll catch it. They're recording. Yeah, they're on the PRS, yeah. I guess go to the just go to the shul website. I guess there's the link from there, or it's on PRS Torah.
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube. It's on shul's YouTube. Yeah, on the shul's YouTube. Yeah. I'm all there. Give it 1 more minute.
Hello. How are you?
Okay, it's 8:02. That's my official start time. All right. Good evening, everyone. This is our third of our 3-part series. So I thought that we would start by recapping a little bit of where we've been, and that'll help us frame our conversation for tonight. So in our first lecture, we started by giving a bit of an overview of kind of who the Netziv was, of his life, of his trajectory. We started with this quote that to get a definitive description of the Netziv with regard to the Torah, the world of Torah, is to say that he was the king of the Rosh Yeshivos and the father of all of Bnei Yeshivos. He is the head of the yeshiva in the world for pretty much half of a century. Not uncontested, as we saw, not without its challenges and difficulties, but Volozhin was the aim hayeshivos, and for the vast majority of its existence, its head was the Netziv, deeply respected across the entire Torah world, right, for that position. And we talked ultimately about the legacy that he left behind, how so many of the leaders of Torah Jewry at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century considered the Netziv to be a formative educator and influence on their lives. And we also noted by the end that there was another set of students, right? Ones who were equally accomplished, but in very different fields, intellectuals well outside the world of traditional Torah learning, who also looked back to the Netziv and considered to him to be a formative influence in their lives. And so we asked the question in our second lecture, where did this come from? Does this make sense? What do we know about the Netziv that may give us some insight into the fact that people like Chaim Nachman Bialik and Michael Yosef Berdichevsky saw and were attracted to somebody like the Netziv? And so last week we looked at the question of what was the Netziv himself reading? What was his education like? And we realized that indeed the Netziv was reading quite broadly as a young man. And we asked this question: does that mean that we've uncovered some sort of secret about the Netziv, that he was some sort of closet masculine, or as I put it last time, I went with glee to my thesis advisor and said, "You'll never believe what the Netziv was reading under his Gemara," to which he responded, what? He asked me the question, right? As a good educator would do. He asked me, "How do you know it was under the Gemara?" Right? Maybe it was on top. And indeed, that sort of led me to further exploration of that world, the world of the first half of the 19th century of the Torah Jewry, of rabbinic leadership at that time, and to what degree were they reading actually quite widely during the first half of the 19th century, citing things that are well considered to be well beyond the pale of what you would find in a traditional yeshiva today. And then we talked a little bit about why it seems that world almost comes to a close by the middle of the 19th century. Things begin to change. The Netziv himself seems to be citing these things widely, and as we pointed out last time, not just citing that he read them, but encouraging his readers to go and read them. And all that seems to end by the middle of the 19th century. So you find it in his earliest work, but you really don't find it in his later and much better known works. And we described with the answer that we gave was that really two things had changed by the middle of the 19th century. The world around the Netziv had changed in the sense that right here, by the end of the reign of Nicholas I, this is when Haskalah really begins to gain a foothold in Lithuanian society. It begins to mean something. If you're reading these things, it begins to associate you with a group of people who may not have been as scrupulous about their halachic observance as others might have been or have traditionally been. It began to mean something very different. So society around the Netziv changed. And the truth of the matter is that the Netziv himself and his position in that society changed, right? What happens in 1853? He transitions from being, he was a Youngelite for quite some time. Then he was just a Maggid Shir, but by 1853, he's the Rosh Yeshiva. And now he's responsible for the education of the students in the yeshiva. So his position in that society changes. So it means something very different for him to say, go read Moses Mendelssohn, go read Azaria Darasi when he's Rosh Yeshiva in a world where Haskalah now seems to be gaining a foothold than it did to cite and say those things when he was a young man and who didn't have that kind of responsibility, living in a world where it really didn't mean quite that much. I'll add one more piece to the puzzle just so that we understand kind of more broadly, I think, the world that we live in today. Another phenomenon which I try to trace in my book that I think happens over, not I think, but that happens over the same time that I think also contributes to the story is actually the rise of the yeshiva. Right? The rise of the yeshiva and the yeshiva movement. Remember, Volozhin is really the first, right? And it spawns many others, whether that be Mir or Telz or Navardik, and then many others, right? That emerge in their wake. And while the rise of the yeshivos contributes to a heightened intensity of learning, a heightened number of people who are sitting and learning, it also, to some degree, narrows the curriculum. Right? There becomes a curriculum. The idea of the yeshiva shemesechtos, it doesn't exist prior to the 1850s. It isn't a thing, right? The fact that there are some things we learn that and other things we don't, right? So just for example, I mean, we mentioned that the Netziv's major works were written on a parish on the Sifrei and a parish on the She'iltos, right? Which are just not things that are commonly studied anymore. As the world of Torah learning becomes institutionalized, the curriculum becomes institutionalized and does to some degree narrow, right? Which is part of what we see and why we see the narrowing of these types of citations. So that's what we looked at last time. And then we mentioned, though, that if we're being sensitive to the world around the Netziv and what's happening over the course of his lifetime, we need to also note that towards the end of his lifetime, another major movement emerges, particularly in the 1870s, but really in the 1880s. So this is the Netziv is already an older man at this point, which is the emergence of Zionism. And we noted last year in our lecture series that while many people tend to imagine Zionism and early Zionism as a Western European phenomenon, the reality is very, very different. Yes, some of the great Zionist thinkers were Western European, whether it's Herzl or others, but the movement itself was an Eastern European phenomenon at its core. And so it very much was happening in the world in which the Netziv was operating. And we noted last time that while it is true that the Netziv, the students of the Netziv, the people who will assume positions of Torah authority in the generation following the Netziv, who will look back to the Netziv as a critical influence in their lives, many of them will distance themselves quite dramatically from the world of Zionism. There is another group of the Netziv students who but were actually deeply engaged in the world of early Zionism. So that leaves us the question of what was the Netziv's attitude towards Zionism? A question which gets even more interesting when we look not only at his students, but at his sons and the institutions today that bear their names. These are both sons of the Netziv. Chaim Berlin, you may be familiar with the yeshiva Chaim Berlin. I haven't been there recently, but I don't think they fly an Israeli flag in front of the yeshiva. Whereas you go to the Bar Ilan University, and they most certainly do. Right? Meir Bar Ilan, son of the Netziv. Chaim Berlin is a son of the Netziv. What was the Netziv's position on Zionism? And I'm actually going to take and sharpen the question even further, because to make it deeply relevant to the world that we're living in today, I dare say that there is no greater question that is dividing the Torah world today, the community, Orthodox community, across the globe, but particularly in Israel today, more than the question of Giyus, the question of draft. And more so than any question in my memory, it is truly ripping apart Torah community in a pretty significant way, where we have masses of Yirei Shamayim, of Lomdei Torah, deeply committed Torah Jews who say things like Giyus l'tzava yareg v'al ya'avor, right? That it's you give up your life, right? Rather than go and fight in the army. And then you have people like Rachel Goldberg. Rachel and her husband Avi taught for me. They're deep, close friends of mine. If you're not familiar with Rachel and her story, her husband Avi was a 10th grade Rebbe who had finished his tzava many times over and went back to become a Rav Tzva'i. And I believe it was the first Rav Tzva'i killed in combat in Lebanon, when he went to help one of his soldiers who had been injured. And he was killed in the process, leaving his 8 children behind. And if you weren't familiar with the story, then you probably haven't heard some of the videos of Rachel at her Shiva, where, first of all, she came out and told the political world that they can come to her Shiva as long as they come members of the ruling coalition together with a member of the opposition. And then at the Shiva, when she had very prominent Rabbanim there, because this one really struck a chord in the Torah world. Avi was a Talmud Chacham and a purest Torah Jew that I knew. She said to them straight out that this has to change. She gave this incredible analogy. I feel like I'm going on a little bit about this, but you can see it's deep. It strikes me and affects me deeply. She said at the Shiva, she said, we have 8 kids at the home. And when Shabbos comes, it can't be that 7 children help get the house ready for Shabbos, and 1 child sits at the dining room table and davens that the house should be ready for Shabbos. And take it even one step further. I mean, she's so amazing. Her kids dressed up on Purim. She has 8 kids. They dressed up with turtle shells on their back. They were tzav shmona. For those who get the pun, at tzav shmona, that's the draft call when you get called up. Tzav means a command, but it also means turtle. So that there were 8 turtles. They were tzav shmona. So this is an issue at the heart of the Jewish people today, at the heart of the Orthodox community today. Where would the Netziv have come out on this issue? And while generally speaking, counterfactuals are kind of a hard place to be in because the Netziv didn't live today, I'm going to show you something rather interesting, I think, perhaps rather startling when it comes to this question. So let's get to it. Was the Netziv a Zionist? Probably one of the easiest ways to know whether the Netziv was considered himself part of the Zionist movement is simply to go to Israel and just look at the street signs, because it is hard to find a major city in Israel that doesn't have a street named after the Netziv. And the way things went, certainly in the early founding of the state, you didn't typically name streets after people who weren't in favor, right, of the early state. There may be, I'm sure there is a street somewhere named after Chaim Brisker, but there aren't tons of them all over. And by my best count, Yerushalayim, Tel Aviv, Petach Tikva, Ramat Gan, Bnei Brak, Rishon LeZion, Chadera, Haifa, all of them have streets named after the Netziv. He was absolutely, and is to this day, for sure, right, in the Dati Leumi community, seen as a pioneer, as a father of religious Zionism. That understanding actually goes back quite a bit. This is an early Zionist group in Volozhin at the turn of the 20th century. And they are, as you can see, as many early settler groups did, they're living under the Russian Tsar, but they are teaching themselves how to do agricultural work so that they can go to Israel and begin to work the land. They called their group Kvutzat HaNetziv. They named themselves after the great Rosh Yeshiva because they saw him already early on completely aligned with their intent. To get more granular in terms of providing evidence for the Netziv's position, we can look at his commentaries. His commentaries certainly have been called, or pieces of them have been identified with Zionist or early Zionist, religious Zionist sentiment. So here is a great example. I didn't give you the psukim before, but Hashem is talking to Abraham. He gives him the promise that this land is going to be the land for his zera after him. And then the Torah repeats it again and tells him a second time that the land is going to be his. And the second time, Hashem says to Abraham, "Kum hitalech ba'aretz," go walk it le'orka le'rachba, walk it its length and its width. And picking up on the second, so the dual commands here, the dual promises here, and the fact that this command to walk it was only raised the second time Hashem promises this to Avram. The Netziv writes as follows: "Arise, walk the land, kum hitalech ba'aretz." He said to him a second gift of the land, meaning after your descendants will be punished and be able to be counted. That relates back to his previous comments. I'm not going to get into it right now. For they will be exiled and diminished. There will be a time they will be thrown out of the land. They will be exiled. They will be diminished. Their numbers will dwindle down. They will then return to the land of Israel and they will live in it, but not in the same way that they dwelt initially in the days of Yoshua, when it was fulfilled that all the land that you see will be yours, meaning you're just going to walk in, you're going to conquer it, and it's all going to be set up and ready for you to live in it. Right? That time, Israel did not build houses. Everything was found before them. But in the second and third exile, it was said to Abraham, our father, walk through the land. And so it will be when the Holy One, blessed be He, returns the Jewish people to the Holy Land, that they will have to build houses and establish a society themselves. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is predicting that the second time you come back, you're not going to find a well-developed land. Buildings won't have been built already that you can just walk into. You're going to have to get out there, right, and begin draining the swamps yourself, right, building society from scratch. Another really interesting place where you can see the impact of Israel and the thinking of the Netziv comes from his a lesser known work. This is his introduction to Ha'amei She'ela, which was actually translated and printed as a standalone work called Darko Shel Torah. It's a phenomenal work where it's almost a kind of a history of halacha, a history of Torah learning. And in this work, he developed certain through lines, certain themes in the development of Talmud Torah. And amongst them, he will distinguish between the Torah Eretz Yisrael and Torah Bavel. We all know that there are two sets of Talmud, right? There's Talmud Yerushalmi and there's a Talmud Bavli. They came from two different places, from the academies that were learning the Mishnah in Eretz Yisrael and the academies that were learning that same Mishnah in Bavel. And the Netziv argues that these two different sets of Talmuds actually represent different methodologies of learning, different approaches to learning. So those of you who are more familiar with the Yerushalmi, you know that the Yerushalmi is more terse, right? It expands less, it explains less. And the Netziv sees this as kind of a direct correlation with what he goes all the way back to Aaron HaKohen and says, beginning with Aaron and Moshe, we had two different approaches, two different ways of getting to truth in Torah. There was the approach of Aaron. Aaron wore the Urim V'Tumim. Aaron was directly plugged into God. You had a question, he could ask a question, he could get an answer. There was clarity, there was direct communication. Moshe didn't have that same line, according to the Netziv. So Aaron's koach was in psak halacha, right? Was in getting the clarity, the simple bottom line. Moshe, on the other hand, had to work through pilpula shel Torah. He had to work through logically and reasoning to get to the answer because it wasn't given to him immediately. And then Netziv will develop these two different lines all the way down to the two sets of academies in Bavel and Israel. And so he writes, so it is the sages who lived in Israel. Sorry, I'll go a little bit earlier. To find his way back to the entrance, so he gives this analogy of somebody's lost in a maze. Right? To find his way back to the entrance, he ties a rope to another so that he can retrace the steps. However, someone who has a lamp that illuminates the way to the door doesn't need to exert that much effort and can find the door with minimal searching and exertion. However, he will not gain an understanding of the palace. Everybody understand? We got it. You're in a palace, right? And it's dark. This person walks in. So one person ties a rope to himself so that as he works his way through, he can know his way back. Right? Another person walks in with a lamp. The person who walks in with a lamp will probably have an easier time finding their way back because they can simply light it up. But who will know the palace better when they're done? Says the Netziv, it's the person who had to struggle through it with the rope. The obvious analogy, which I can't believe the Netziv didn't mention, is of course ways. Right? There was a time where we actually had to know our way around certain places. We struggled sometimes. We actually got lost. We made a wrong turn, but we knew the neighborhood, right? Today, nobody has any idea where we're going, right? Because we just tell Waze where we want to go and Waze takes us there, right? Same thing, right? Same thing. So it is with the sages who lived in Israel. Since the merit of Israel illuminated their path, there was no need for great toil in order to reach the right decisions. If you lived in Israel, you're plugged into God, right? There's a direct connection there. The answers come easier by living in Eretz Israel. However, the Babylonian scholars between the first and second temples could not discover the light of legislation without great effort. In addition, they stumbled many times until they arrived at the proper conclusions. This is analogous to the Amoraic approach to study, as demonstrated in the commonly found statement in the Babylonian Talmud. The words I said before you were mistaken. Along these lines of Talmud Gittin, right? I'm not fine. However, after much such stumbling, by virtue of the great understanding, the Babylonian sages following the first temple produced the great enlightened legislation. Obviously, the issue which he's contending with is at the end of the day, it's the Talmud Bavli, which is authoritative for us, not the Talmud Yerushalmi. And that is because he says through that struggle, right, of finding your way, you actually get to a greater truth, to a greater understanding than if it's all simply lit up for you. Take it or leave it, we see the beginning of the idea of Torah Eretz Yisrael, that there's something fundamentally different about learning Torah in Israel, which again is something very much connected to what will become the world of religious Zionism. That's commentary. What about his actual political activity? So if you remember, Chovevei Tzion or Chibat Tzion is something we discussed a little bit last year. Immediately following the pogroms in 1881, there was a group of Russian students who will go to Israel. They called themselves Bilu, Beit Yaakov Lechu V'Neilcha. They will establish Rishon LeZion, the first agricultural settlement, right, in Israel in 1882. Doesn't look much like this anymore. But in its wake, an organization will emerge, will kind of transform from Chovevei Tzion to Chibat Tzion with the particular purpose of supporting these early settlers in the land of Israel. So we noted last time also, this is a early conference of Chibat Tzion in which Leon Pinsker was appointed the chairman and Shmuel Mehilliver as the president. You can see that this is already then a largely, just looking by the heads, right, of the men assembled, you can see that there is a large group, right, who seemed not to have their heads covered anymore at this point in 1884, but there was certainly representation within this group, right, of those, this guy still doesn't look happy, right, of those who are, right. So in shortly after this group will send a letter to the Netziv asking for his support. And we're here talking primarily for fundraising support, right, for Chovevei Tzion. And this is a letter that the Netziv writes back. So we have seen, I don't know why it's there twice. Oh, right, that's why. Okay. that God stirred the spirit of his people in Israel in all parts of the world to settle desolate inheritances in the Holy Land and to establish settlements there for the dispersed of Israel. Again, this is ChatGPT doing the translation here. Does a pretty good job, but a little awkward at times. And the voice of God knocks on the doors of our hearts, saying, "Open for me," and opening in your actions, for the time has come when it will no longer be said about the land of Israel that it is forsaken, and there is no one seeking it. And now the curse of God has departed from it, that the land should be desolate. The word of God has come in a covenant, saying, "And the land I will remember, v'ha'aretz ezkor." There's something happening. God is remembering the land, says the Netziv. From now on, we must know that it is a commandment. Me'ata aleinu ladat ki mitzvah v'chovah. Right? It is a commandment, an obligation upon whoever believes in the promises of good and comfort to lend a hand to the commandment that comes before us to form an association that will be established for the land of Israel. And each one of us will extend his hand to give the society's fund each week what we can find in our heart. And although we are poor people, and we do not have in our power to do anything specific in this matter for the purpose of settlement, nevertheless, we must gather coin by coin and find an accounting and send it to the place where they are engaged in building with a generous hand, and to make known that it is our will to complete, it is that our will is complete to participate in the founders of with the founders of the settlement in the land of our forefathers, and our thoughts will bring them strength to their efforts. That is, we'll give what we can give, but even more important than the financial support is going to be the moral support. That these people know that we, every single week, we've got a pushka and we're putting something in it because we're thinking about them, and we deeply appreciate, right, what they are physically doing in the land of Israel. And as it was in the days of Ezra the scribe, who gathered some thousands from all types of Aramean people, Torah scholars and God-fearers, and also those men who had married foreign women, who were accustomed to the desecrating of the Sabbath and did not know the Torah at all these gathered and prepared the settlement of the land in the cities until afterward the land was filled with its inhabitants. What is he referring to? Why is he mentioning this here? What is he saying?
Even though these are not so religious, it's still
right. He's recognizing, he's calling it out. I recognize, right? He's talking here to others in the Torah world who are concerned about supporting something which is clearly, right, the majority involved here seem to be more secular, seem to be within the Maskilik world. He's reminding them, right, that in the days of Ezra, when the Jewish people came back to the land of Israel, by the way, right, they weren't all perfect then either, right? The Tanakh makes that very clear to us, right? There were people who were married to foreign women. Right? That's for sure. So what makes us think that we should be any different now, or that we should hold ourselves to a higher standard? So we must awaken to the voice of God's will, heard from one end of the world to the other. In every place where our brothers are scattered, driven away and afflicted, to do what we can, little or much, from all types of Jews. And those gathered should go up to settle the land of Israel and build it and plant it in every fruit tree, and upon them will be fulfilled the word of Ezra the scribe. The hand of our God is upon all those who seek him for good, and may his hand, blessed be his name, be with us to increase the work of the Jewish people in every place they gather for this purpose, and to broaden our perspective of the settlement of the land of our forefathers, so that our hearts will rejoice here in Volozhin as well, that we have merited to be counted amongst the settlers and founders of the settlement and building, until we merit to experience the pleasantness of the land and eat from its fruit and be satisfied and observe all the commandments of God, dependent on the land of joy and holiness and purity speedily in our days. Amen. In the month of Kislev, 1885. Strong statement? Strong statement. What do you think Hovevei Zion thought when they got this letter? They're supported, right? And what are they going to do with this letter when they get it? Oh, they're going to send it around, right? They're going to publish it. They're going to publish it in newspapers, right? They're going to put it out there, right, for the rest of the world to see. Well, next letter that the Netziv writes to the Hovevei Zion in Warsaw. Your letter with the enclosed writings, which they have established to support the sublime matter of the settlement of the land of Israel, all have reached me to my satisfaction. Before I answer, I will say before your honor, may you be well, the words of the rabbis and gracious Rabbah and the Midrash. If Reuven had known that the Holy One, blessed be he, writes about him, and Reuven heard and delivered him from their hand, he would have carried him to his father on his shoulder. And if Aaron had known, and if Boaz had known, so I say, if I had known that my words, written before the small group of young lovers of Zion and Volozhin, young in number, would rise upon the leaves of scattered in the world and move before the eyes of the heads of the holy communities, I would have linked it. I would have said something a little different. Like, I didn't know this was going to be published. I didn't know somebody was going to post it, right, on Instagram. Had I known, perhaps I would have written a little bit differently. Nonetheless, now he's going to write that letter. He says his busyness, right, and much holy work in the yeshiva. He was very much an administrator of his yeshiva, and it took up a lot of his time. Nonetheless, right, he is now going to write a proper letter, right? So that now that I've been drawn to be called one of the lovers of Zion, now that I am considered to be one of the Chovevei Zion, and they have also recognized me in the humility to send me a collection of writings and regulations, he was officially made. I think that the title was Gabbai, right? He was an advisor. He was an official advisor to the movement. So now, right, I see that by divine providence I have been drawn, and after them I will run to be of assistance to and a member, right, of your honors. May you be well. He says, Amen. Amen. Right. So now he's going to expand about why. Why is this important? Why is he doing what he's doing? And he says that this holy group, the Chovevei Zion, have two, right, sublime qualities. One is for the settlement of the Holy Land by our brothers, the people of God, right? Because of our sins, we're being pursued without end. Right? In other words, anti-Semitism. Right? We need a place in Israel because the prospects for Jews in Europe today are bleak. He writes in 1885. This is probably 1886. Because of our sins, we're being pursued without end. And for many suffering Jews, there is no hope in the land of their dispersion. And it is good that there is some suitable place for Israel to rest. We need a place. However, now we see that providence is bringing it to this. We must pursue and strive with all our might to acquire and plant, right, as the word of the Lord sojourn in this land. And they expound in the Midrash Rabbah, make a dwelling in the land, plant, sow, and establish. And although Yitzchak alone could not settle the land in his time, when it was under the rule of the Canaanites and the Philistines, nevertheless, what Yitzchak would settle was precious in the eyes of the Lord. So we must know that what we settle within the work of our hands is precious in the eyes of the Lord, even under the rule of the Sultan. That is, our avos lived in the land of Israel when they didn't have rule over the land of Israel, and that was considered to be something of deep value. So too, the fact that we don't have sovereignty in the land, says the Netziv, is not a reason, doesn't make it any less important for us to live there and to settle it. The second virtue, and I want you to think now about what you know about who the students of the Netziv are. The second virtue is the unification of many different opinions into one center, which is a cornerstone for all the scattered people of the Lord, both in scattered places and in the evils that are different in the ways of the world. I'm not sure that that's the right word. And we have been blessed that this matter of settlement in the land is the correct bolt that locks Israel from one end of the world to the other into one opinion in this matter. And at a time when all of Israel are united and they are called friends, as it is stated in the tract of Pulin, when everyone is like one person, they are all friends, love and pure. Amongst them, God will dwell and judge justly. Israel, he says, can and ought to be a unifying factor within the Jewish people. It brings different types of Jews together. And that is a purpose of settling the land of Israel. Right? Furthermore, I thought it fit to suggest, let's stop there for a second. What does it sound like? Okay, right? So Rav Kook, the student of the Netziv. Now, they'll differ in many important ways, for sure. Right? But you can begin to hear, right, some of Rav Kook in his teacher in the Netziv. Okay. Furthermore, I saw fit to suggest that many great men of Israel complain that in some communities where their leaders and community managers have gathered and counted to speak about this commandment, they have deliberately moved to discontinue funding the charity of Meir Balanes, which is the lifeblood of the inhabitants of the Holy Land, or other charity funds. This becomes a major issue, right? When Chovevei Zion is beginning to fundraise for those in the new settlements, the agricultural settlements in Israel, there's a fear, which seems to have been founded in certain communities, that the money that people were now giving to these yeshuvim was being taken away from the old yeshuv. from those who had been supported for generations, who were living off of the support of the diaspora. Generally, that community was largely in Yerushalayim, and there was a fear that the money that was funding them would dry up as a result of funding these new communities. We must know ourselves that we cannot judge with our own minds and decide which charitable matter is greater than its fellow. For our sages say about David, may he rest in peace, that he erred in that he allotted much gold for the building of the temple, did not prioritize using it to provide sustenance during the days of famine, and he was punished for this by having that gold brought for the building of the temple, for God does not desire injustice. And David, may he rest in peace, thought and erred. How much more so do we not know how to weigh the scales of charities? Don't stop giving one in order to give the other. We need to give both. We are not in a position to judge. New Yishuv versus old Yishuv, says the Netziv. Who are we? David HaMelech had trouble figuring that out. We certainly can. And what is more, we have not yet come to the rest of the inheritance, and our desire is still far from us. And other charities stand poor and crushed before us. God forbid for us to touch them, lest they cry out to God and we find ourselves guilty. God forbid. Therefore, it is proper that the arrangers of the Holy Association's order should warn with great warning not to touch any charity fund. God forbid. That is, it is important to you, Chovevei Tzion, that when you go out and you fundraise, you make clear that you cannot go in and take money out of the pushka for Rabbi Meir Balanes and put it into the pushka for the new Yishuv. God forbid. Right? That is not something. That is not what we're advocating for. If you gotta dig deeper, and even if it's a little bit, right? But we have to be able to give both. Good. That is what the Netziv writes. He is clearly part and parcel of Chovevei Tzion in its earliest stages. So we have a Zionist commentary. We have the letters that he writes in support of Chovevei Tzion. We have the position that he accepts within the organization of Chovevei Tzion. And then we have the account of Rav Kook, which we looked at in our first lecture, the earliest biography written of the Netziv, written during the Netziv's lifetime. And there Rav Kook writes, גאוננו הנציב שליט"א הוא המחזיק בכל כוחו ברעיון הנשגב של יישוב ארץ הקודש. כמה פעמים יצא לדבר על דעת קדושת הדעה הזאת in the newspapers לבית ישראל, ומי ייתן וירבו רבנים ומורים כמותו בין בני ישראל אשר בארץ רוסיה כהגאון הזה. He was machzik, he was strengthened and supported bekol kocho with everything he had, this idea of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. All right, was the Netziv a Zionist? Certainly seems that he was. Now let's take a look at another side of the Netziv. I don't like this term, I'm sorry. I'm using it because I don't have a better one. But it begins to get at, you understand that we're talking about here ideological positions, and that's ultimately what I want to get to and what I want to. Well, then we looked at the period of 1885 to 1887. Chovevei Tzion becomes an established organization, and Netziv clearly throws his lot in, understanding that and calling on the entire Jewish community to support their efforts. Well, in 1887, reports begin to come back to him of what is happening in these yeshuvim. And suffice it to say that the Netziv is not overjoyed by what he hears. So this is a letter that Rabbi Shmuel Muhilver, again, who is a leader of Chovevei Tzion, is writing to the Netziv. And you can see in it, you can begin to hear what the Netziv himself was beginning to suggest and advocate to do in response to the behavior of these early settlers. So your letter from last Sunday reached me with regard to the people of Gedera. I have no concrete knowledge of their behavior. I don't know. I haven't been there. I haven't seen what they're doing. However, even if everything that was written about them is true, nonetheless, woe unto us if we should treat them like rebels. For without a doubt, when we tell them to leave their places and go somewhere else, they will not lend us a listening ear. They will turn their backs to us. And then, heaven forbid, they will breach the Torah openly. What's going on? The reports are saying the people in Gedera they're not being so medactic, right, in their Torah mitzvahs. And what does it sound like the Netziv's suggestion was? Treat them like Mordim, treat them like rebels, and get them to leave. And I'll show you more. Therefore, I agree with Dr. Pinsker, and that we should appoint Rabbi Yechiel Michal Pinnis as their head, and he will oversee them in matters physical and spiritual, in Torah and in Derech Eretz. I imagine that he knows how to interact with them, and they will listen to him, for he did much for them with their initial arrival in the land of Israel. And with time, there is hope that we might restore them to good. And if you say, why do we need such trouble? Let's give them no support, and they will necessarily be forced to leave their places. All the more so when we give them the necessary funds to build houses in Chutz La'aretz. You should know that I do not agree. For the numbers of those who do not care so much about the upholding of religion are great. And when they hear what it is we want to do to them, without a doubt, it will strengthen in them all types of resolve and intentionally remain precisely where they are. It seems that the Netziv had a proposal to deal with Mechalelei Shabbos in Gedera, not just by asking them to leave, not just by cutting off their support, but actually raising money to relocate them in Chutz La'aretz. We will give you the money, pick up and leave, because this is not his vision for what these settlements were supposed to be. That was 1887. And there is constant back and forth between the Netziv, Shmuel Mohilver, Pinsker, constant on this issue. The Netziv wants there to be somebody appointed in these Yeshuvim who is responsible and tasked with ensuring that Torah observance is followed, that people are Shomrei Halacha. Shmuel Mohilver, Pinsker will push back. You saw Shmuel Mohilver do it not just from an ideological stance, but from a political and socioeconomic stance as well, believing that if we do this, we're going to lose all support, right, for this. They outnumber us, he says, right? This is not going to be a good move for anybody if we try, in fact, to do that. 1888. 1888 is the year that they are emerging on, the first that they're approaching. The first Shemitah in which Jews are now working the land of Israel again. We've got settlements. We've got people who are depending on the land of Israel. And so the question becomes, what are they going to do over Shemitah? And this is the origins of what we know today as what? The Heter Mechira, right? The idea that, that the land can be sold to a non-Jew and continue to be worked, continue to use what is produced by the land as a way of maintaining the sustenance of the people who are on that land. Without getting too far into any of the halachic arguments, it's important to know that Heter Mechira starts with a fundamental premise, which is that Shemitah Bizman Hazeh is D'Rabbanan. It is only rabbinic. It is not Torah. It doesn't have the force of Torah law. It only has the force of rabbinic law. So in the rabbinic establishment in 1888, the lines drew pretty evenly, meaning those who were against this project of resettling the land of Israel, those who were not in favor of supporting the Chovavei Tzion, were understandably not supporters of a Heter Mechira of any sort of Heter that would allow them to continue to live off of the land. And those who were deeply embedded in this and supportive of this movement were the ones who were going to be supportive of this Heter Mechira. And the Netziv on this issue will break rank. In his Tshuvos, we are not going to read this. I just want to show you the extent to which he addresses this issue. It's actually referred to as the Kutros Dvar HaShmita in his Tshuvos, and it goes on for multiple pages in which he is making the argument, right, that in fact one cannot rely on a Heter Mechira, and that Shemitah has to be observed, right? So he writes, regarding the sabbatical year, many opinions have already been given by those seeking leniencies according to their initial understanding, who have decided that sabbatical year in our time is only rabbinic law. And upon this foundation, they have added additional arguments. But my opinion is not so. For the opinion of the Rambam is clear to me, and he holds that the prohibition against work in the sabbatical year is a Torah law. and he will go on from there to insist that there is no grounds for something like the heter mechira. And it is wondrous to me, about your honor, may you be well, who knows and understands the spirit of the people of Lithuania and its environs, that the main reason they donate to settle the land is not to sustain a certain number of people, but to restore, it should be the soul of our holy land. He says, can't you understand that this is not about them living in, this is not about welfare. This is about Eretz Yisrael. This is about the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. It's about observing the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael. That's why we're doing this. That's why my supporters, those in our community, are supporting this. And this does not mean to restore the region of Palestine, but rather the sanctity of the land of Israel. And if the sanctity of the land is not properly observed, the givers will completely withdraw their hands and will no longer cause this mitzvah to be transgressed. And even amongst the wise men of the nations, it is widely known that the sabbatical year amongst Israel is Shabbat Lashem. Even non-Jews understand that. And the whole world is looking at what we're doing here. And it is already known that the generous baron, who is that? Montefiore, good, right? May his honor live long, and will not shorten his hand and refrain from sustaining the people who depend on it. Meaning, if you support this heter mechira, he will pull his funding. We will pull our funding, because that is not what we are looking to do. And more than I'm afraid for the destruction of the settlement, it is more appropriate to worry about the people of the settlements. They should not be idle all year round, and God forbid, reach idleness that leads to boredom and transgression, God forbid. And therefore, we must pay attention, as I inform the collectors who participate with me in this mitzvah. But to permit work, God forbid, is not something we can consider in any way, right? So I am worried, he says, what are people going to do all day? What do you think his suggestion is going to be? What should they do? Of course, they should sit and learn, right? And we're going to get to that. But that's his worry. His worry, God is going to protect. And God is going to take care of them. We're going to make through this. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried what they're going to do all day. And that's what we should be putting our attention to, says the Netziv. That was 1888. 1890. And take you back again to last year. One of the key works of early Zionism was the work by Netziv Kalisher, known as Drishat Zion. Well, there was a new publication, a new printing of Drishat Zion, which you can imagine. Post 1881, there's new yeshivim. People are actually going, this is happening. People are going to go back and start printing these works that were key, that have the ideological underpinnings of this resettlement of the land of Israel. And so they went to the most prominent rabbi in the world, who was a supporter of the Chovavei Zion, and said, we're printing a new copy of Drishat Zion, of Netziv Kalisher's work about the religious importance of settling the land of Israel. Will you write a haskama for it? And the Netziv says, no. Today, honorable distinguished rabbi and preacher who captures souls with his words, when he preaches his moral lessons, I have already written briefly to your honor, may you be well, that my soul is not pleased with the work Drishat Zion that the honorable rabbi brought up. For it is founded on a misleading light that he saw in the Western lands where equal rights were given to our brethren. And he imagined that this is the promise of, and the Lord your God will return your captivity and compassion upon you. From now on, we must arrive at the end of the verse and return and gather you, etc. But these are all vain words, right? So, V'shav Hashem lekecha et shvutcha v'richamecha, V'shav v'kibetzcha, meaning he sees, that is, Netziv Kalisher is seeing what? He's seeing a process of geula. And says the Netziv, not so fast. Not so fast. Because the main return of Israel will not be from the Western lands, right? The fact that there are Western empires and Western monarchies who are giving their blessing to the return of Jews to the Holy Land, says the Netziv, is not the geula that was promised to us. It's not even supposed to come from that direction, right? But they are from the uttermost north. And Yirmiyahu the prophet said, I will bring them from the land of the north and afterwards gather them from the uttermost parts of the earth. And B, Because this light of equal rights has dimmed the eyes of our brethren in the Western lands and undermined their Jewish identity, except for a select few. Thinking that the future of Israel is going to come from Western Europe is anathema to the Netziv as well. That's not our vision for what Israel should be. Right? And see, because before this verse it is written, and you shall return to the Lord your God and obey his voice. And that has not begun to be fulfilled at all. Right? The idea before Hashem starts gathering us in is we're supposed to be following the Torah. And I don't see that happening, says the Netziv. Right? Furthermore, the foundation of the aforementioned Gaon's opinion that this is the beginning of redemption. Right? And with this, he concludes his words to explain how we will arrive at the redemption. And in truth, no one knows to what extent the order of the future redemption is. We can't jump to conclusions that what we're seeing is Geula, says the Netziv. And therefore, he says, it is forbidden for us to mention the idea of redemption in the matter of settling the land. And it is forbidden for us to show signs of redemption in the matter of settlement. Only God stirred in our hearts to restore the desolate places of the land and to make it habitable, and we know nothing more than this. We have nothing to say about this except to wait with our hearts and believe in the redemption in whatever way he wills it according to our deeds. Therefore, I do not agree to return and print the book, Rishat Sion. Now, I want to be clear here. The Netziv is not saying that he doesn't see the hand of God in this. We saw him write that explicitly in his letters to Chovevei Tzion. He does see the hand of God, but he is not willing to call that Geula. He does not want to make the leap and say this is the process that was prophesied right, in our Tanakh, that is in fact, that he sees as dangerous. Okay. So, we have somebody who is not at all comfortable with Mechalei Shabbos B'Farhesia, right, with people who are openly violating Jewish law, to the point where he advocates resettling them outside the land of Israel. We have somebody who is not at all comfortable and not willing to give a heter, to work the land, even if it means the sustenance of those people over the course of the Shemitah year. We see somebody who would not have been comfortable, at least in his day, to make to do the Tefillah L'Shlom HaMedina and call Israel Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. He definitely would have skipped that line again had it been said in his lifetime. The last issue. I hope there's somebody in this. There are many learned people here in the room tonight. I have given this multiple times, and I've challenged the people in the room to show me that I'm wrong, and it hasn't happened yet, but it may happen tonight. I think that the Netziv is the oldest source that we have that explicitly writes that we can defend the borders of Israel by studying Torah. Now, let's understand that before the most recent upheaval around Giyus, right, where today so much of the argument is about the influences of the army and what happens to kids when they go in. Right? The core argument when this first started was really not that. The core argument was what's laid out in a very simple tshuva by Rav Moshe Feinstein, that here, right, Haganah, right, that when somebody sits and learns Torah, right, therefore, certainly whoever has a desire to Torah study and to become great in Torah and Jewish law and in fear of heaven should go to yeshivas, and it will be a blessing for all of Israel and a great defense for all of Israel, right? They can't study. We can. And studying has a protective value to it. We are protecting. We are doing our part. We are doing our part by sitting and learning. You're doing your part by going out with a gun. That was the core argument in many communities for quite some time. And again, I believe that the earliest source for that is actually from a member of Chovevei Tzion. Torah writes about the Yovel year, Yovel So on the 50th year, you shall proclaim liberty, right, throughout the land. It's Yovel. And each of you shall return to his holding. Two things the Torah seems to say. Go back to your land of inheritance and go back to your family. Next, not next passage, but a few psukim later. What do you do then? Do the commandments, and you will live upon the land in security. The classic understanding of this pasuk that a person should go back to their inheritance, Rashi brings down that the field goes back to its owner, right? The field, the achuzah, goes back to the person who initially owned it. It's the release of property after 50 years. The Netziv obviously understands that halachically that is what has to happen, but he believes that there is a pshat instruction here as well, which is that the people have to go home. Everybody has to go home on the Yovel. Let's look at it. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. This includes the warriors. Nichlal bazeh balei milchama ha'omdim michutz lebeitam b'shibud hamlucha. This includes the soldiers at the front line, says the Netziv, who are stationed away from their homes under the service of the monarchy and the laws of the state. In the Yovel year, they have to go home. Leave the front line. Go back home. And you shall return each to his family. Even if a person does not have an ancestral landholding, still he returns to his core family. And all members of the family gather together. Yovel is a time that extended families get back together. Tashuvu, the well-known interpretation, refers to complete return, but the simple explanation is that the initial return might mean that one comes back during that year to their place and family just to visit. Lest you think this is just a stop in, go visit the grandkids and then you leave, right? No. That is not what the Torah is talking about. You need to sit there and stay. Therefore, the verse emphasizes, you shall return again, indicating a full and permanent return to one's family. This gathering of family members in their ancestral homeland helps repair the estrangement caused by the initial separation, allowing them to settle permanently amongst their kin. An amazing idea. This is family therapy. This is everybody goes home and works out the issues that caused you to separate in the first part. Every 50 years, whether you like it or not, you're getting back together and you're working out your issues. Then the Torah says, V'asitem et chukotai. I'm not going to read it inside here, but here's what you need to know. Every time the Netziv is consistent. V'asitem et chukotai, v'et mishpatai. This is a reference to not doing the Torah laws, but Torah study. Torah study, right? And then the last thing that it says is V'shavtem ala aretz levetach. Now put it all together. Every person needs to go home. Even soldiers at the front lines, they need to go home on the Yovel. What do you do during that year? You have to do my laws, which means you have to study my laws. You have to learn Torah. And then the pasuk says, V'yishavtem ala aretz be'ladetzach. Then you will be secure. So you shall dwell on the land securely. This verse explains the reason why during the Yovel there's a focus on increasing Torah study. Normally, the security of the land depends on strong warriors stationed at the borders. Important point. Normally, you need fighters. You need people with guns, people in tanks, people flying in jets. However, during the Yovel, all warriors return to their ancestral homes, leaving the land exposed and vulnerable. Additionally, since Yovel follows the Shemitah year, the royal treasuries are empty as there is no agriculture produced with stored. Therefore, the Torah warns, and you shall perform my statutes, which again to the Netziv means you need to learn, implying that the safeguarding of the land during this time depends on spiritual protection. Torah study, especially deep engagement and analysis, pilpul, serves as the metaphorical sword of Israel. Pilpula shel Torah hi cherbam shel Yisrael, providing spiritual defense. The more dangerous the physical situation, the sharper the sword must be through intense Torah study. There you have it. The best I know, an explicit statement that if you want to physically protect the borders of Israel, you sit and you learn. And to show you, though, that the Netziv did not just imagine this, he wrote this in his Perush on Chumash, as a theoretical idea. We're back in the Kuntrus Dvar HaShemitah, and the Netziv writes explicitly. Right? Indeed, more than we need to fear the cessation of the settlement due to the lack of work in the land for 1 year, we need to fear the corruption of the inhabitants of the land who will be idle from all field work for a whole year. And idleness leads to boredom and to sin, God forbid. And therefore it is written in the Torah, Parshat Behar, in the middle of the Parshat of Shemitah and Yovel, and you shall do my statutes and keep my judgments and do that, and you shall dwell in the land in safety. And the explanation of this is that my statutes are the Midrashim, my judgments are the laws that is taught in the Sifrei and Kiddushin, and the Midrashim are the general principles by which the Torah is expounded. And the Torah said that in the years of Shemitah and Yovel, when there is no field work and they are idle, we also do not have granaries of grain needed for war, and thus there is a danger of war. Therefore, you should engage in Talmud Torah, which are the Midrashim and the laws derived from them. And in this way, you will be safe from war and you will dwell in the land in safety. Practical, real advice to people living in Israel at the time. You want to be safe, you want to be secure over this year. What you need to do is get to the base medrash and start learning. So, is the Netziv a Zionist? So it's a Haredi. Is the Netziv the father of religious Zionism? Is he the father of what we would consider to be more Haredi positions in Israel today? Well, we've seen and we understand, right? A world that sees Torah learning as the ultimate objective, something which can sustain us, something which can protect us, which has become core to the understanding of the yeshiva world today, is very much something that can be traced back to the Netziv, something that can be traced through his preeminent Talmidim, and something, right, that we've seen appear in multiple different kinds of places. Right? At the same time, we saw, right, the Netziv as a member of Chovevei Tzion, somebody proudly asking and understanding that this is a secular movement. Right? A secular movement which yet he's advocating that we engage with, that we give money to. And therefore we see the Netziv, the Zionist, in his commentary, we see it in his work with Chovevei Tzion, we see it in the account of Rav Kook, and of course then we understand why the Netziv and how the Netziv could give rise to a son like Chaim Berlin, and at the same time to a son like Rav Meir Bar Ilan. Was the Netziv a Haredi? Was he a Zionist? He was indeed the Zionist father of Haredi ideology. Thank you.